What still haunted a legend, even at the edge of death? Ozzy Osbourne, the most powerful voice in rock, the father of heavy metal, the Prince of Darkness loved by millions, had everything most people could only dream of: fame, power, immortality through sound. But behind that legacy was a lifetime of sorrow, a chain of regrets so heavy that not even the loudest stage could drown them out. In the final days of his life, as he prepared to leave this world, Ozzy sat with the most important woman of his life. Sharon, the one who had stood beside him through madness and fire. In a trembling whisper, he spoke it all. Every wound, every failure, every shame. And it was truly heartbreaking. Before we begin, raise your thumb with us, not just as a gesture, but as a tribute, to honor and remember the Prince of Darkness. Among the regrets that haunted him until the very end, one emerged as the most brutal, not because of what it did to his body, but because of what it stole from his spirit. The spinal surgery, a final, desperate decision made with hope, but met with devastation. "I thought the surgery would save me," he confessed, "but it crushed me completely." What was meant to be salvation became his slow undoing. Infections crept in. Nerves deteriorated. Parkinson's advanced like a thief in the night, tearing through his motor functions piece by piece. He couldn't walk. He couldn't sit up. Even flipping over in bed felt like being stabbed, he said. "Those 3 months after the surgery, I was nearly useless. Every little movement was agony. Even blinking felt like effort. It was an unrelenting hell." Ozzy would later recall, "The past 4 years have been sheer hell for me. My health has been in a terrible state." This wasn't just pain, it was betrayal. He had believed in the miracle of medicine. He had hoped for relief. Instead, he was met with silence, suffering, and regret. "No one told me leaving it alone might be better. No one told me I could live out my days in peace without being cut open," he lamented. It was a rare admission from a man who had once been invincible. But behind those words was something deeper. The mourning of music lost. "I regret having that surgery. I regret ever believing that cutting into my spine could bring me back to life. It didn't save me. It took me away from the only thing I had left: music." Imagine being Ozzy Osbourne, the very embodiment of sound and chaos, reduced to a whisper that even he could barely hear. That surgery didn't just take his physical strength. It took his voice, his power, his sense of self. He didn't just lose the stage. He lost the meaning of movement, of expression. The man who had once commanded arenas with a single growl now sat still in darkened silence, barely able to raise his hand. The cruel irony? He had agreed to the surgery in the hope that it would let him sing again, let him walk again, let him live again. And instead, it closed the curtain. By then, Ozzy was no longer the wild man who leapt into crowds and screamed until stadiums shook. He was a quiet soul confined to a chair, dependent on others to move from room to room. A prisoner in his own body. But even in that fragile state, he never lost sight of what kept him grounded. "It's not those doctors who kept me alive," he whispered. "It's Sharon, that woman who supported my messy life. She should have left me 1,000 times, but she never did." There were moments in those last months when his hands trembled uncontrollably, yet he still tried to grip a pen, to scribble lyrics that would never be sung. Nurses would find scraps of paper with single lines, broken verses, forgotten melodies, fragments of the voice that once thundered across the world. Andres, those quiet evenings, Sharon would sit beside him, holding the hand that once held microphones like weapons, and remind him, "You're still here. That's enough." He had lived through decades of chaos. He had danced with death before, but nothing prepared him for the realization that sometimes trying to fix what's broken only breaks it more. It was a cruel lesson. The worst part? He had chosen it. He had signed the form, trusted the promise, and paid the price in silence. And so, in the quietest hours of his life, this became one of his most haunting regrets. Not because it ended his career, but because it ended a part of his soul. His legacy didn't need saving, but in trying to protect what he thought remained, he lost what mattered most. The ability to say goodbye through the thing he loved most: music. This wasn't the fall of a rock god. It was the quiet descent of a man who gave everything, and in return was left with memory, pain, and Sharon's steady hand. As we reflect on this first of 7 heartbreaks, we don't just see Ozzy the legend. We see Ozzy the man, wounded, remorseful, and painfully, devastatingly real. The second regret, a betrayal so intimate it scarred Ozzy Osbourne more deeply than any wound his body ever endured, was his infidelity to Sharon. For decades, she had stood by him, unwavering through the whirlwind of addiction, fame, arrests, and public meltdowns. She had cleaned up the chaos, rebuilt what fame had shattered, and turned a man drowning in his own demons into a legend. And yet, despite all of this, Ozzy faltered. "I did a terrible thing to the only woman who ever stood by me," he would later admit, his voice heavy with shame that even time could not dull. The betrayal came to light in 2016, sending shockwaves through a marriage that had long been considered indestructible. Sharon, after discovering the affair, did not scream or run. She didn't seek vengeance or sympathy. She cried, and then she stayed. That choice, her staying, was what tormented Ozzy the most. "She should have left me 1,000 times. But she didn't. And I hate myself for giving her another reason to consider it," he confessed in a rare, painfully honest interview years later. This wasn't a tabloid scandal to him. It was a soul-crushing failure. Not just of fidelity, but of gratitude, of character, of love. Sharon had seen him through the worst storms of his life. She had mothered his children, managed his career, and quite literally saved his life, again and again. And in return, he broke her heart. The weight of that choice and the silence that followed became a kind of purgatory that stretched for years. In those final months, as his body failed and his mind grew increasingly fragile, this regret never left his side. "It haunts me," he said. "I look at her, and I see everything I could have destroyed, everything I nearly threw away." There were nights when Ozzy would sit awake long after Sharon had fallen asleep beside him, just watching her breathe, wondering how a heart he had broken could still love him. He once wrote a letter, 4 pages long, pouring out his guilt and sorrow, but never gave it to her. He burned it. "She's already done enough. She doesn't need my apologies. She deserves peace," he whispered to a friend. He remembered the day she forgave him, not with words, but with silence. She brought him tea, sat beside him, and turned on one of his old records. No grand speech, no accusations, just presence. And that, Ozzy once said, was more painful than any confrontation, because it meant she still loved him, still believed in him, and that made his failure feel all the more catastrophic. There was a quiet moment in 2020, years after the affair, when their daughter Kelly looked at him and said, "You hurt Mum, more than anything else ever could. But she still wakes up and makes you coffee every morning. That's love, Dad. That's what it looks like. Ozzy never forgot that. By 2025, Ozzy had already endured spinal surgeries, Parkinson's decline, and public farewells. But nothing cut deeper than this particular remorse. It wasn't the physical pain that kept him up most nights. It was this: the image of Sharon. Eyes red, voice quiet, yet still choosing to stay. That image became a kind of private purgatory. He never stopped trying to earn her forgiveness, though he believed he never fully could. There are some things you can't undo, he once wrote in a note found by his bedside table after his death. You just live every day trying not to break what's already cracked. And he tried. He tried in small ways. He gave up certain tours, spent more time at home, learned to listen without interrupting. A skill he admitted took him decades to grasp. He celebrated their anniversary in silence that year, placing a note under her pillow that read, "You never left, and that's all that kept me alive." This was the great tragedy behind the public image. To millions, they were the power couple of rock. But behind closed doors, there were fractures, mended not by time, but by the quiet strength of a woman who had every reason to walk away and simply didn't. Sharon's decision to stay was not a sign of weakness. It was the strongest act of mercy Ozzy had ever known. And perhaps that's why, in his final days, he returned to that moment over and over again. Not to excuse himself, not to justify, but to remember what real love costs and how devastating it is to almost lose it. Even as his voice faded, even as disease and regret waged war inside him, Ozzy held Sharon's hand and mouthed the words he once couldn't say. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I love you." Some regrets don't scream. They hum quietly, constantly, like a sound only the soul can hear. For Ozzy Osbourne, this pain came not from illness nor scandal, but from a haunting truth. He never truly learned to speak the language of the very thing that saved his life: music. "I screamed on stage," he once confessed, "but I never learned how to truly speak to music." Despite being one of the most iconic voices in rock history, the godfather of heavy metal couldn't play an instrument. Not the guitar, not the piano, nothing beyond a few strained notes on a harmonica. It wasn't for lack of desire, it was shame. A shame that followed him in every recording session, every band rehearsal, every moment when he wanted to express a feeling, pure and raw, but didn't have the vocabulary to do it. He could feel pain. He could sing it, but he couldn't explain it. "I sang with wounds," Ozzy later said, "but I didn't know how to present them. That made me feel low." This wasn't just about musical technique. It was about a kind of isolation that fame couldn't cure. Surrounded by brilliant guitarists, drummers, and producers who spoke in chords and notes, Ozzy often felt like an outsider in his own kingdom. And the older he got, the deeper the regret grew. In the quiet of his final years, long after the tours had ended and the lights had dimmed, he would reflect on this absence. The instrument he never learned, the conversations he never had with his own art. For someone who gave so much to music, it was one of the most painful ironies. He could fill arenas with screams, but inside, there was a silence that no applause could reach. And that silence hurt. It wasn't tragic in a theatrical way. It was tragic in a human way, invisible, constant, and unfixable. He once admitted to a producer during a late-night recording session, "Sometimes I wish I could just sit at a piano and let it all out. But I never could. And now it's too late." That moment, that confession, haunted him long after the soundboards were turned off. It wasn't just about skill, it was about connection. To others, to himself, to his grief. That missing connection made his success feel, at times, incomplete. But that regret was only one chord in a darker symphony. The second was louder, more public, and far more brutal. The collapse of Black Sabbath's final album with Ozzy, Never Say Die. At the time, the band was unraveling. Addiction, exhaustion, and miscommunication had poisoned what once felt unbreakable, and the music suffered. Ozzy would later call it not just a bad album, but a complete failure. "We were heading into nothingness," he said. That album wasn't just bad, it was a total collapse. Released in 1978, Never Say Die was supposed to be a reaffirmation, a declaration of strength, but it ended up being a death rattle. Critics panned it. Fans were confused. Even the band didn't believe in it. It was rushed, disjointed, and worst of all, it didn't sound like Black Sabbath. Ozzy's voice, though still powerful, felt lost in a sea of unfocused arrangements and muddy production. For him, the shame wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. He had let down the people who believed in him, the band, the fans, and perhaps most devastatingly, himself. That album became a wound he carried for decades, a reminder of what happens when the soul goes numb and the art follows. And though he would later find redemption in his solo career, the scars of that failure never faded. He didn't just regret the album, he mourned it. He once described it as a tombstone in my discography, a marker of what could have been if only they had been stronger, clearer, healthier. In a 2017 interview, he reflected, "I listen to that album and I hear confusion. Not just musically, but in my life. I was lost. We all were." That admission added weight to an already heavy memory. Fans often asked why he never performed songs from Never Say Die in later years. He would simply shake his head and say, "Some songs weren't born. They were buried." In his final reflections, Ozzy would often return to these twin regrets. One quiet, one loud, one invisible, one impossible to ignore, but both cut from the same cloth. The unbearable weight of knowing you could have done more. If only life had been kinder. If only time had been longer. If only you had known how. And it's in these regrets, unflinching, unhealed, that we see not just the legend, but the man. Broken, brilliant, and still begging, until the very end, to be heard. Some regrets burn like fire, others whisper like ghosts. But for Ozzy Osbourne, a few truths remained too painful to ignore, even after decades of fame, music, and survival. In his long, storm-scarred life, struck chords that were both haunting and heartbreakingly human. He never minced words about the ultimate sin. It was the one album in his catalog that he could barely listen to without wincing. Released in 1986, at the peak of his solo career's commercial success, the album rocketed to sales milestones. But the price? Ozzy's soul felt absent. "I sold myself to the public," he later confessed, "but trading away your soul is never worth it." Behind the glittering success was an exhausted, fragmented artist. Drug-fueled sessions, creative disconnects, a pressure to conform to glam metal aesthetics he never truly identified with. The album's polish, he felt, was a betrayal of everything raw and wounded in him. It wasn't the scream of the man who bled on stage night after night. It was a product, clean, digestible, and empty. And that emptiness followed him for decades. "I don't hate the songs," he once said, "but I hate what I had to become to make them." It was a ghost in his discography, a reminder that not every victory is worth the cost. The ultimate sin wasn't just a title, it was a wound. And then, the final concert, the sacred closure, and the absence that haunted it. The Black Sabbath farewell show, held in their hometown of Birmingham in 2017, should have been perfect. But it wasn't, because Bill Ward, their original drummer, wasn't there. "We started together," Ozzy murmured years later, "and to close the doors without him, it felt like betrayal." For Ozzy, it wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. The man who kept time as they carved a new genre into existence deserved to be at the finish line. But legal disagreements, health issues, and time's cruel march got in the way. Fans noticed, critics commented, but none of that mattered as much as the personal ache Ozzy carried. That stage, bright, roaring, final, had a missing heartbeat, and Ozzy felt it. That night, even with all the noise, he shared, there was a silence in me. A part of us was gone. The lights went down, the audience roared. But deep in his heart, there was a pause that never ended. Perhaps the most complicated regret came wrapped in laughter, fame, and living room screens around the world. The Osbournes show, which catapulted the family into reality TV stardom in the early 2000s, was groundbreaking. It made Ozzy a household name beyond music. It humanized the Prince of Darkness, but it also came with a price he would later admit was too high. "I'd turned my family into a show. My kids became content," he said, voice heavy. The cameras were constant. The lines between performance and reality blurred. And while audiences adored their chaotic, profane, deeply relatable household, inside those walls, the cost was accumulating. Kelly and Jack, still finding themselves, became global spectacles. Sharon, his pillar, became a public figure in her own right, weathering scrutiny and criticism from all corners. Ozzy, struggling with sobriety and neurological decline, was often filmed in vulnerable, compromised states. The world laughed, but at home, it left scars. "There are things I wish the world never saw," he admitted. "Things my children never signed up for." It was, in retrospect, a Faustian bargain. Fame surged, privacy vanished, and though the family remained close, the wounds of exposure never fully healed. These regrets, an album that cost his authenticity, a farewell that lacked completion, and a show that made spectacle of sanctuary, remained etched in memory. And they weren't just about career missteps, they were about soul, integrity, and love. Ozzy Osbourne, with all his chaos, power, and contradictions, faced them not in denial, but in raw, brutal honesty. He named his regrets, he owned them, and in doing so, gave us one final lesson, that even legends hurt, even icons bleed. And in the end, it's not about being perfect, it's about being real. And they weren't just about career missteps, they were about soul, integrity, and love. Ozzy Osbourne, with all his chaos, power, and contradictions, ended his life not in denial, but in raw, brutal honesty. He named his regrets. He owned them. And in doing so, gave us one final lesson, that even legends hurt, even icons bleed. And in the end, it's not about being perfect. It's about being real. Some people walk with you in the sunshine, but Sharon Osbourne walked with Ozzy through the fire, through the madness, through the silence of hospital rooms and the noise of stadiums, through scandal, betrayal, relapse, and redemption. She was there, not as a passive witness, but as the steady pulse that never wavered, even when everything else did. When Ozzy crumbled under the weight of his regrets, It wasn't therapy, or fame, or even music that held him together. It was Sharon, the woman who saw the boy behind the myth, the one who stayed. When the betrayal came, the one that shattered headlines and nearly broke a marriage 4 decades in the making, Sharon didn't leave. She stood in the ashes. She cried, but she stayed. And that act, more than anything Ozzy ever sang, screamed, or survived, that was grace. She became more than his wife. She became the steward of his soul, the guardian of his final wishes. She protected his silence when words became too hard. She built structures where there had once been only chaos. And she forgave him, not loudly, not for the world to see, but in the quiet, brutal stillness of private rooms where a man drowning in regret looked into the eyes of the only person who truly knew him, and she didn't turn away. That kind of forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken. It's written in the way she smoothed his sheets, in the way she read his expressions when he could no longer speak, in the way she made sure his legacy wasn't defined by scandal, but by humanity. She didn't erase his past. She anchored it. She turned his pain into poetry, his mistakes into lessons, and his shame into something he could hold without breaking. She bore witness to his most painful truths and loved him anyway. Sharon wasn't just there at the end. She had always been the end game. The one person who, despite every crack, every sin, every fall, refused to let the man disappear behind the myth. In Ozzy's final days, when the body failed and the voice went silent, it was Sharon's voice the world heard. And it was enough. More than enough. Because when she spoke, we didn't just hear Ozzy's story. We felt his soul. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Sharon wasn't just that she stayed. It's that she kept believing. Believing in a man who didn't believe in himself. Believing in a future, even when doctors said there wasn't one. She carried him, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, when he could no longer stand. She held the weight of a broken legend and never once asked to be praised. Her love wasn't loud. It was relentless. It didn't demand recognition. It became air. It became breath. It became the quiet engine behind a man the world called indestructible. And when Ozzy could no longer give her music, no longer give her strength, no longer give her even words, she gave him everything she had left. Her presence, her calm, her unwavering hand in his. There are love, stories written in fairy tales. And then there are the ones written in ashes, in silence, in second chances. Sharon didn't just love Ozzy Osbourne. She rebuilt him. She protected what was sacred when the world saw only spectacle. She carried the man, not the myth. And in the end, when all the lights went down and the stage grew quiet, it wasn't the roar of the crowd that mattered. It was the whisper of a woman who had seen it all and still chose to stay. In every regret Ozzy named, there was Sharon. In every apology he couldn't say, she had already answered. And in the final chapter of his extraordinary, chaotic, pain-soaked life, she didn't just bear witness, she gave it meaning. She turned his ending into something beautiful, into something that didn't scream with shame, but hummed with love. Because no matter how broken a man becomes, if someone stays, really stays, then he was never truly lost. And perhaps the greatest proof of her love and his redemption came just days later, when Ozzy stepped onto the stage one final time. July 5th, 2025. The night Birmingham stood still. The air was thick with memory, with reverence, with a silence more powerful than any roar. This wasn't just another concert. It wasn't even just a farewell. It was the moment Ozzy Osbourne chose to wrap a lifetime of chaos, brilliance, regret, and redemption into one final performance. The city that gave birth to Black Sabbath now witnessed its final bow. There were no fireworks, no dramatic entrances, no pyrotechnics, just dim lights, a hushed crowd, and a fragile figure, cane in hand, emerging from the shadows. Ozzy Osbourne, the immortal voice of heavy metal, walked slowly to center stage, trembling, vulnerable, and completely unmasked. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He whispered, not into the microphone, but into the soul of every person watching. This is the last time I will ever stand on a stage. The crowd erupted. Over 40,000 people burst into tears, applause, and gasps. But Ozzy? He remained still. He bowed his head. He closed his eyes. And then he sang. Every lyric came out like an apology. Every chorus felt like a confession. Gone were the theatrics of his youth. In their place, rawness, truth, reckoning. The stage wasn't his battleground anymore. It had become his sanctuary, a place to atone, to honor, to release. Few knew just how much it took for him to stand there. The rehearsals had been brutal. Each step was agony. The weight of Parkinson's, of failed spinal surgery, of infections and nerve damage. It was all still there. During soundcheck, he had to sit between every take. Breathing was shallow. Pain was constant. But he never canceled, never complained. Because this wasn't about him. It was about the music, about the fans, about one final moment of truth. He didn't just perform the hits. He revisited the songs that marked his darkest hours, the ones that once echoed through rooms of addiction, betrayal, loss. And yet, tonight, they sounded different. They sounded healed. Songs like Changes, No More Tears, and even Paranoid took on new meaning. They weren't anthems of madness anymore. They were lullabies for a soul preparing to let go. Sharon stood just behind the curtain, watching every note leave him, every word carved from his weakening breath. She didn't cry. She held her hands to her heart, as if to collect every piece of him being given away. And the band, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, stood close, no longer as gods of rock, but as brothers. They knew this wasn't about legacy, it was about closure. Yet something was missing. Bill Ward, the original drummer, wasn't there. The absence was palpable. Ozzy looked toward the empty kit more than once during the set, and though he said nothing, the weight of that silence was unbearable. "We started this together," he once said. "Closing it without everyone feels like betrayal." But still, he carried on, because he had to. Because some endings, however incomplete, must be honored. But perhaps the most soul-shaking moment came at the close. No encore, no grand finale. Just one quiet sentence before the lights faded. "Thank you for letting me live this life." And then, as the final chord dissolved into the night, the screens lit up with a message that broke every heart open. In honor of this final performance, all proceeds, $190 million, will be donated to Cure Parkinson's, Birmingham Children's Hospital, and Acorns Children's Hospice. This was Ozzy's final act of redemption. He couldn't rewrite the past. He couldn't undo the betrayals, the absences, the years lost to addiction and pain. But he could leave behind something right, something true, something that healed. And in that moment, as 40,000 voices sang the final notes with him, Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just a man saying goodbye. He was a soul making peace. Every regret folded into every lyric. Every tear met with gratitude. Every ounce of pain transformed into a legacy of grace. This wasn't a concert. It was a prayer, a thank you, a final embrace between a man and the world that once both loved and misunderstood him. And as the lights dimmed and the silence returned, all that remained was the echo of applause. Not for the legend of Ozzy Osbourne, but for the man who dared to stand, broken and brave, and say goodbye on his own terms. 17 days later, he was gone. It was in the quiet hours before dawn, on July 22, 2025, that the roar of a lifetime finally faded. Ozzy Osbourne, who had spent more than 5 decades screaming into microphones, shaking stages, and defying death, slipped away in silence. At his home in Buckinghamshire, under the soft rustle of curtains swaying with the early breeze, he passed in the arms of the only person who had been there through it all, Sharon. There was no spotlight, no applause, no encore, just the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint ticking of the wall clock, and the sound of steady breathing, until there wasn't. As the final moment arrived, Ozzy looked at Sharon with a gaze emptied of fear, but full of peace. "I'm tired," he whispered, voice barely above a breath. "But I'm not afraid." It was a whisper that pierced deeper than any scream he had ever released on stage. A man who had once lit up arenas with his fury now dimmed gently into the dark. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He simply let go, like a curtain slowly drawing closed on a play that had run longer, louder, and more chaotically than anyone ever imagined. Sharon held his hand as his eyes closed. She did not sob. She had cried too many times before, during the overdoses, the accidents, the relapses, the diagnoses. But this was different. This was sacred. Her hand remained in his until the last flicker of warmth left his skin, until she was holding not just Ozzy, the man, but Ozzy, the memory. And the world, unknowingly, paused. When the news broke later that morning, the world did not erupt in noise. It stopped. A sudden, deafening stillness echoed across continents. Radio stations silenced their morning chatter to play his songs. Social media flooded with black and white photos, with heartbreak emojis, with one single unanimous cry, "Thank you, Ozzy." Streets in Birmingham saw fans laying flowers, lighting candles, and hugging strangers. In New York, Times Square flashed a tribute. In Sao Paulo, a spontaneous choir of hundreds sang, "Mama, I'm coming home." In Tokyo, candles shaped in the form of a bat, the symbol forever tied to Ozzy's name, flickered in vigil. And yet, what made his passing all the more haunting was how intimately quiet it had been. No headlines could capture that final whisper. No article could fully describe the way he looked at Sharon. It was a farewell not just to her, but to the chaos, the pain, the guilt, and the music that had once saved him. It was a goodbye from a man who had already given everything, even the parts he should have saved for himself. He had nothing left, not even pain, just that final moment of surrender. But there was one thing he had done, one moment that brought him peace. Just 17 days before he passed, Ozzy stood on stage in Birmingham, where it all began, and gave the performance he had been dreaming of. It wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, but it was everything. Every lyric was a release. Every boo was a redemption. He had spent a lifetime regretting what he couldn't undo, but in those final moments, he finally did something right. That night was not about fame. It was a gift, a final offering, a promise kept to himself, to Sharon, and to the music that saved him. And maybe, just maybe, that performance, braved through pain, trembling hands, and tears he hid under the lights, was enough to help him let go. Maybe that final act of defiance against regret was what let him close his eyes in peace. In the days that followed, tributes poured in, not just from rock icons, but from everyday people. Nurses who listened to Ozzy on their night shifts, veterans who survived war zones with his songs as a battle cry, single mothers who found catharsis in his growl. To them, Ozzy was never just music. He was validation. He was a reminder that broken people can still build legacies, that scars can still shine, and that chaos, if wielded with heart, can become something holy. Sharon, just days later, gave a televised statement. She sat in the very same room where he took his last breath, holding the same wedding ring he had placed on her finger over 40 years ago. Her voice cracked only once. "He didn't die with fear," she said. "He died with peace, because he knew he gave it everything. He didn't run away. He didn't fade. He faced the end the same way he faced life. Head on. Loud when needed. Silent when it mattered." His funeral, as per his wish, was kept private. No fanfare, no red carpet, just family, a few close friends, and a playlist of the songs he had loved. Not just the hits, but the ones no one talked about. The ones he'd written in hotel rooms while crying. The ones he played alone in the studio, trying to hold himself together. The ones Sharon said felt like reading his soul. But the world didn't stop mourning. Fans organized their own vigils. Musicians across genres, from metal to country to hip-hop, paused concerts to honor him. And in the silence after every tribute, one truth remained. There would never be another Ozzy. Because in the end, this was more than just the death of a rock star. It was the end of a movement. The end of a life lived on the edge of a knife. The end of a love story forged in fire. And the beginning of a legend that would never fade. For as long as voices scream and guitars wail, as long as pain turns into poetry, as long as there are misfits looking for a place to belong, Ozzy Osbourne will never truly be gone. He didn't go out in darkness. He went out in light, quiet, software, but eternal. What if the real cause of death isn't always written on a certificate? He didn't die because of Parkinson's. Not really. His body had long begun to fail him, nerves misfiring, muscles betraying him, and pain stitching itself into every breath. But that wasn't what broke him. It was the quiet weight of 7 regrets, each heavier than the last. It was the memories that wouldn't stop playing even when the music did. The performances he wished he could erase. The promises he never kept. The nights Sharon cried alone. The children watching their father unravel. The words he couldn't unsay. And as the world tried to make sense of his final breath, one truth lingered in the silence. In the end, what took him was not illness, but the unbearable weight of unfinished redemption. Not pain, but the silence that followed it. For a man who had lived through madness and screamed through chaos, it was regret that finally outshouted him. There are wounds that time never closes, and his soul bled quietly through every whisper, every sigh, until it simply had nothing left to give. Heroes don't die because they hurt. They die because they no longer believe they can fix the damage they caused. Ozzy didn't fear death. He feared not making it right in time. And that fear, more than disease, was what wore him down to his final breath. And finally, before you go, sit with this moment. Let your heart answer gently. Have you ever lived with a regret that whispers when the world is quiet? A choice, a silence, a goodbye you wish you could rewrite? If Ozzy's story touched something tender in you, not just the pain, but the courage to face it, then let this space hold you. Leave a like, not for numbers, but as a tribute. And if you can, share a thought, a memory, a small truth. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with knowing we've all carried something we wish we hadn't. And tonight, maybe Ozzy helped us carry it together.